After roughing up the campus bullies into helping him collect votes, Chris went back to class. He didn't plan to stay. He sat down just long enough to gather his things, then stood up again. Before leaving, he called out to the others who were already settling in. "Hey, everyone. I taught those trash a lesson, so you can get back to studying in peace. I'm heading out to campaign. Don't waste the quiet I fought for." "Thanks, Chris. We'll make the most of it. Good luck with the student council election," one of them replied. "Study hard. I'll be back," Chris said and left. He made his way to the gym, not to work out, but to find his subordinates. The group of thugs he'd enlisted to canvass votes were useful, but only because he'd coerced them. He didn't entirely trust their loyalty. He wanted reliable men nearby, positioned so they could cover him from different angles once the election took off. Inside, Hanger was on the bench press with Ma'an spotting him. Ma'an glanced up when he saw Chris and mouthed, "He's here," lowering the bar for Hanger. Hanger set the bar down and wiped his hands with a towel. The two of them left the gym. Ma'an hurried up to Chris and then froze. Chris looked taller. "Boss, aren't you training today?" "Whoa, have you been taking something? You got huge," Ma'an said, eyes wide. He was on the basketball team and already 183 centimeters, yet Chris was now noticeably taller, more than half a head above him. Ma'an wondered if Chris had been on some growth drug. Hanger, meanwhile, gave only a shrug. He'd long suspected Chris was no ordinary kid and wasn't surprised. Chris didn't bother to explain. He'd get them answers soon enough. "Do either of you have a car? I need a lift," Chris asked, though his gaze settled on Ma'an. Both men immediately looked at Ma'an. He always bragged about his father being a well-known lawyer and had implied his dad had pulled strings to keep Chris out of trouble. Between that and the key case Ma'an always carried, it was obvious he owned a car. "Of course, boss. Follow me," Ma'an said, fishing his keys out of his pocket. They walked to the parking lot. Ma'an climbed into a muscle car and grinned. "Ford Mustang GT. Pestered my dad for ages before he agreed. The dealer owed him a favor, so we got it for $3,000. Sweet, right?" Chris slid into the passenger seat. Hanger, not old enough for a license, hopped into the back. Ma'an took the wheel. "You sure this isn't a stolen ride?" Hanger teased as Ma'an closed the door. Chris gave the car a casual once-over. 80% new and no smell of blood. Looks like the dealer respected your dad, didn't rip you off." Ma'an laughed. "How do you even know if there's no smell of blood?" "I've been driving it for months. I don't even know if someone died in this car." "You'll find out soon enough. Take us to the old beverage processing plant, the sour plum juice factory. Do you know where it is?" Chris rattled off the address and paused, worried Ma'an might not know the way. Ma'an perked up. "Oh, that place? The sour plum factory where 13 people died from allergic reactions? I know it." "Good. Let's go." With that, Chris buckled his seatbelt. Ma'an pulled out of the campus lot and drove them toward the factory. During the ride, he told them the story everyone whispered about. His father had handled the case that closed the plant. The owner had originally been facing a $200 million fine and 20 years in prison, but Ma'an's father negotiated it down. The factory itself, worth about $80 million, was confiscated, and the owner paid a $130 million fine. The 20-year sentence vanished after the owner donated $10 million and did 2 weeks of community service at the police station. According to Ma'an, that community service was more about keeping the owner safe from vengeful families than about punishment. Hanger sat in the back like he always did, expressionless, used to hearing about big money and favors. Chris felt a little bitter and amazed. West, his uncle-in-law, had done favors for him, and while Chris had been grateful when West took 10% of the shares and got the preliminaries done in a day, he hadn't expected him to lean on government assets so freely. It was petty and bold at once, almost textbook capitalism. Use the system to settle debts. Chris couldn't confront West about that. He wasn't president yet, and he couldn't challenge how West handled state resources. But he made a mental note. Once he had more power, he'd make sure West earned those benefits instead of freeloading. They pulled up to the old plant. Ma'an parked on the roadside and stared at the sign over the gate. "Hey, has this place reopened?" "DeBrode? What kind of company is that?" he wondered aloud. Chris smiled. "It's a new functional beverage company. Trust me, you'll like it." Then he led the way into the factory yard. Man and Hanger exchanged a puzzled look and followed him inside. DeBroad Factory. Chris stood for a moment, looking up at the beverage processing plant in front of him. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. This was his first concrete step toward the presidency, and the first move in unfolding his plans in the main world. As he reached the gate, a familiar voice called out, "Heh heh, this place isn't open to the public. If you want to play, go to the abandoned plant across the street. Don't cause trouble here." Chris followed the voice and saw a pair of dog paws holding up a newspaper inside the guard booth. The paper was spread wide, hiding whatever was behind it. The paws alone gave the owner away. "Brian, what are you doing here?" he asked. "Chris? Oh my God, skipped class again?" Brian dropped the paper and looked genuinely surprised. "There's no such thing as skipping class at West High. This is an educational field trip. I brought my friends to see the factory. What about you? Did Jiaozi send you?" Brian's flustered tone would have sounded accusatory if Chris hadn't known the truth. Brian had indeed been hired by Jiaozi, the short, bossy one, to man the gate. Jiaozi's argument had been simple. She was a dog, so of course a dog should do dog stuff. Brian had bristled inwardly at the insult to his dignity, but she'd paid too well to refuse. $800 a day to sit in a booth, drink tea, and read the paper was an offer hard to turn down. He'd convinced himself that luck shouldn't be hoarded by anyone else, and took the job willingly. He'd been between gigs anyway. The script he'd been working on collapsed again, and he needed cash for gas. Now, however, the factory's real boss had appeared at his booth, and Brian suddenly felt small. Right. Jiaozi asked me to help. Since you're bringing guests, hurry on in. And say hi to Stewie for me," he blurted, then swung the barrier open and half-pushed Chris forward. Chris didn't question it. A talking dog guarding a factory was, at least, a clear sign the place was run by unusual people. Before stepping through, he glanced in the booth to make sure there was no beer. Satisfied, he went into the plant. Brian watched him go, then quickly shoved a magazine called America Dog back under the newspaper. If Chris saw what he was reading on the job, who knew what he'd say? Ever since Chris had come back from the hospital, he'd seemed like a different person. Brian sometimes half convinced himself the real Chris was dead and something else was wearing his face. But then Jiaozi was closer to Chris than anyone, so Brian forced the thought away. "Maybe I've been under too much pressure," he muttered, picking the magazine back up. On the cover was a white Samoyed, and Brian sighed. "When I get off, I'll make you look fabulous," he told the picture, voice soft with indulgence. If Chris knew about Brian's suppressed vanity, he might have helped. Chris wasn't the same man he'd been, but when it came to beauty and grooming, he could still sympathize. Mayan and Hanger, who were with Chris, didn't bat an eye at a talking dog. Strange things had become ordinary in this world. Sometimes animals, or even plants, stones, and islands gained intelligence. Governments handled them in different ways. In the US, awakened ordinary pets often wound up treated like undocumented immigrants, with their rights limited unless they found legal status. Rare species, or those with special abilities, got treated differently. Some drew patronage. There was, Chris recalled, a huge yellow rooster 2 streets over with an immortal, indestructible power. The CIA had taken it on as an asset and given it a home. It hated Peter, and they fought constantly, but oddly the rooster never killed him. Peter always walked away bruised while the rooster emerged unharmed. Chris suspected some other force protected Peter. They moved into the production area, and Jiaozi, hard hat on, short legs hustling, was already on patrol. She was berating a line of robots. "Hey, blockhead, that material is for Zone A. Why are you hauling it to Zone C? Are you delivering batteries to your granny?" she snapped. "And you, loitering by the water cooler like you're recharging. I've been watching you 5 minutes. Fully charged yet? Get back to work." She noticed Chris, picked up a freshly bottled drink, took a swig, and waddled over. "The machines are still too dumb. The code I wrote can't stop all their errors. If only we could get Skynet's program," she said, eyes gleaming. Chris grinned. "It's already 10 times more efficient than manual labor. Besides, if it were Skynet, who knows, it might trigger the shutdown sequence." Jiaozi pouted, annoyed her idea had been seen through, but she moved on. "Who are these? What are you bringing them in for?" she asked, staring at Ma-En and Hanger. Chris introduced them with a calm smile. They're my subordinates. I want to build them up offline and train a personal guard. Jiaozi's eyes lit up. Right now, we're doing 200,000 a day. If we ship a lot, we'll get capital and can scale up, she said matter-of-factly. Chris cut in. No, we're just recruiting at school for now. 300 bottles a day will be plenty. Do it your way. I trust you. If anything happens, tell me, Jiaozi said, and for a moment she looked like a warrior moved to tears by the trust placed in her. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. It was the kind of premonition that said Jiaozi was about to rope him into something. He'd already spoken, though. Backing out now would make him a poor leader. Still, unease tightened his gut. As he was getting ready to leave with the drinks and send Ma-En and Hanger to collect the samples, Jiaozi lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Why so nervous? I just want to do a quick body scan and record some of the world coordinates stored in you. It'll help you determine which worlds you can travel to. It's beneficial. You wouldn't turn that down, would you? Chris's instincts raised red flags. A trap could be hiding behind that helpful offer, yet the information sounded invaluable. He hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Okay, but don't trick me. Jiaozi laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Ha! Of course, we're family. 43. Prepare for both. Brian, guard the door well. I'll give you a raise in a couple of days. Chris followed Ma-En and Hanger, who walked ahead carrying 3 boxes each of the dragon blood beverage. Chris alone carried 8 boxes, 4 in each hand, and still looked perfectly steady. The 3 of them had collected enough drinks in one trip to win over the school's athletes. At the security booth, Chris put on a show for Brian, who was bored and wagging his tail. The dog's ears perked up at the promise, and his tail wagged even harder. I hope so. I'm looking forward to getting paid and having a drink at the bar, Brian said skeptically. Ha, you'll get the chance, Chris laughed. After stashing the dragon blood beverages in the trunk, Chris waved to Brian and drove off. Back at school, he went over the operating procedures with Ma-En and Hanger, then sent them out to recruit members. Thanks to the drink's potent effects, by the end of the day, most of the school's athletes had joined the little group Chris was forming. At first, a few suspected the beverage was some new stimulant or party drug. Once Chris casually showed his strength after a drink and let them try it themselves, though, those doubts vanished. One bottle kept you energized all day with no apparent side effects, like a fairy tale tonic. For athletes who lived on stamina and performance, it was irresistible. In short order, Chris had more than 200 reliable direct followers. Even if the troublemaker crowd turned their backs on him, these gym kids would secure his path to the student council presidency. They weren't the rowdy bullies who swaggered around school. Among those 100-odd hooligans, only a few were presentable, and only one, Priya, could really help him. The athletes, by contrast, already held positions: student council assistants, class representatives, and other offices where a strong build made a favorable impression on whoever made selections. With their votes and influence, the current president wouldn't be able to cling to the post, even if he tried to repeat a grade to hang on to power. In the gym, Chris stood in front of the cable crossover machine, holding up a bottle of dragon blood. I entrust the presidency to all of you, he announced. I guarantee that as long as I'm student council president, everyone here will get 1 free bottle of dragon blood every 2 days. Long live President Chris. We love you, Lord Chris. Chris! President! President! As soon as Chris finished, everyone raised their bottles and drank. The combination of the buzz and his promise sent the crowd into ecstatic cheers. Money moves people, sure, but Chris wasn't handing out cash. He was giving them something rarer: health and energy. He did warn that the drink would be sold for $5 a bottle when it hit the market in 2 days. That only made them more eager. Once the product launched, everyone who knew what it did would rush to buy it. Early production would be scarce, and ordinary students wouldn't be guaranteed a purchase. Wealthy buyers would hoard it. So rather than wait in uncertainty, it was far better to pledge loyalty now and get the good stuff for free. After the initial excitement settled and the crowd regained some rationality, Chris quieted them with a hand signal. He pointed at Ma-En and Hanger. Register with these two and pick up your drinks from them. When I'm not around, they're the vice presidents of our mighty fitness association. Okay, boss. Okay, president. He dismissed the crowd and turned to Ma and Hanger. You two go to the factory every 2 days to pick up stock. Keep records at the factory and for distribution. Track everything, he instructed. Okay, boss, they answered, still a little dazed. Chris didn't care whether they'd actually remembered every detail. This was a minor operation that wouldn't derail his larger plans, and assigning them the job was a quick test to see if they were reliable or likely to cause trouble later. With that taken care of, Chris left the gym and waited at the school gate for Louise to pick him up. Megan was already there. Since they were seniors, their day ended earlier. Chris waved. Hey, Megan, have you gone to check out the beverage factory? It's already operating normally. Megan looked around, didn't spot her clique of sisters, and took off her headphones. No, my graduation plan isn't finished yet. I don't have time to deal with anything else. Graduation plan? That's easy. You're a major investor now. Make up some data, submit it, tweak Coca-Cola's template, and you're set, Chris said. If that's too much, get Wes to write a recommendation. Then you can ignore Shepard. Can you really do that? Megan asked, surprised. She hadn't thought it could be so simple. Think about it, Chris said. Don't bother with a sincere report. That's pointless. Megan, eldest daughter of the Griffin family, sank briefly into self-pity. The problem felt suddenly trivial in Chris's eyes. He shook his head. She was still too young. Had she lived the rougher life he'd known in prison, she might not be so bothered by this stuff. But he wouldn't let negative news touch DeBrod's management. As a shareholder, he'd keep things clean. They waited a moment more and saw Louise pull up. She hopped out, apologizing as she parked. Sorry, kids. The supermarket had a big sale. I took a bit too long. It's okay, Mom. Let's go home, Chris said, climbing into the passenger seat. Megan slipped into the back silently as Louise started the car and drove off. 44. Dumpling's Revenge. The Griffins were gathered around the dinner table. Haha, Peter, that's hilarious. Your company actually has bereavement leave for pets? Is it really that compassionate? Louise laughed so hard she couldn't close her mouth. Having grown up in the Pewterschmidt family, her father a prominent Rhode Island capitalist, she'd learned early what kind of cold-blooded creatures capitalists could be. Hearing Peter's story about pet bereavement leave, she assumed he was joking. Peter, however, wore a grave expression. Hey, Louise, I'm serious. I checked with my supervisor. They really do have it. In fact, because that guy's on leave, my workload doubled. Do you know what that means? Louise wiped her eyes and, finally sobering, asked, Does it mean you have to work overtime? No, Louise. Peter shook his head solemnly, then brightened. It means I can take 7 paid days off, too. Peter, Louise covered her face. Do you realize what you're saying? Brian is family. Brian, mid-bite, barked, What? And stared at Peter with an incredulous, hurt look. Chris glanced up, curious whether Peter was about to do something outrageous again. Peter hurriedly waved his hands. Heh, what are you thinking? I'd never kill Brian just to get time off. That half convinced everyone, and even Brian's expression softened. After all, Peter had rescued Brian from a pet shop. You didn't doubt a family member that easily. But then Peter added, Besides, Brian's practically a sentient creature with rights. He's not a pet. The company would never accept pet leave for him. God damn it. I shouldn't have trusted you. Brian exploded, flinging his empty plate at Peter and storming out. The plate bounced off Peter's broad girth harmlessly. Chris reached out and caught it before it hit the floor, preventing any Griffin family property damage. He set the plate down and gave a small, secret nod. This was classic Peter. Everyone was still stunned when they heard the small, excited babbling from Jiaozi, Dumpling. Louise immediately rose to soothe him. The others couldn't make out what the little thing was saying, but Chris heard it clearly. Let's go, Chris. I've eaten enough. Have you finished? I want to go research other worlds now. Chris sighed and stood. I'm full, Mom. Let me go coax Stewie. He picked up Jiaozi, Dumpling, in his arms. Oh, my boy is so sensible, thanks, Louise gushed in that sugary tone she reserved for such moments. Meg watched Chris's retreating back with suspicion. Her hearing was good enough to catch fragments of what Jiaozi said, but not enough to piece together whatever arrangement they had. Thinking about graduation, she didn't press it. Chris carried Jiaozi to the second floor. At Jiaozi's call, a shimmering portal opened into the secret base hidden in another dimension. Chris set him down at the threshold, ready to step in, when the small voice piped up. "Stop! Can't you just carry me inside?" The little guy wrapped his arms around Chris's neck and clung tight. Slightly exasperated, Chris picked him up and carried him inside. Okay, get down now." "Just a little longer. Your hug feels amazing. It's even better than a luxury mattress. Mind if I nap in your arms?" Hearing that, Chris, red-faced, promptly tossed Jiaozi out of his arms. Mechanical arms inside the base extended instantly and caught him, cradling him midair. The sudden weightlessness made Jiaozi blink. Then he realized where he was and barked. "Fuck you! What are you doing? I'm exhausted from the factory. Can't I rest in your arms for 2 seconds?" Chris had to admit the accusation wasn't entirely without merit. Keeping the factory running and assembling robots was tiring. Seeing Chris's guilty expression, Stewie immediately understood why Chris had reacted the way he did, and exploded in an indignant laugh. "Jesus! What are you thinking, you idiot? Maybe in some parallel universes I'd be different, but in this universe, my Stewie is completely normal. Stop defiling me with your filthy thoughts, okay?" Chris stammered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have thought that about you." But Jiaozi was not interested in apologies. He was genuinely annoyed and spoke coldly. "I don't want to argue. Hurry up and go inside so I can record the world coordinates on you." Chris frowned at the hibernation pod-like device in front of him, confused, but Jiaozi's tone shut him up. Just as he was about to step in, Jiaozi handed him a metallic wristband with a sci-fi design. "Put this on." Chris's first thought was that it looked like a reincarnation watch. He looked at Jiaozi for confirmation but got none, so he examined it. Apart from telling the time, it seemed ordinary. He slid it on and found nothing strange. Relieved, he stepped into the hibernation pod. The hatch shut with a hiss. Jiaozi's face twisted into a sly grin. "Fuck, how dare you insult me? I'll show you. I'll send you to a world where you'll get a taste of hardship." Jiaozi began extracting world coordinates from Chris's body. Between Chris's 2 previous traversals, his body retained traces of other worlds. Jiaozi wanted those coordinates. With them, and his technology, he could open wormholes and jump worlds at will. But because of Chris's careless thought, Jiaozi decided to put that capability aside and teach him a lesson first. Frustrated, he searched for a suitable target and found a perfect set of coordinates. "Ha! What luck! This one is just right. Heaven works fast." Confirming the world, Jiaozi activated the space-time device built into the pod and forced Chris's traversal talent to initiate. In an instant, Chris vanished from the pod. But unlike his previous disappearances, this time, the Family Guy world did not slide into a space-time pause. Life at the Griffins continued on as if nothing had happened. 45. Final Destination Family Guy world. Jiaozi, Dumpling, watched Chris disappear into the hibernation pod in silence. After checking that time was flowing normally, an excited smile spread across his face. "Excellent. Everything is unfolding exactly as I predicted. The space-time synchronizer can indeed anchor Chris's time state. Now let's see if this guy can taste death's wrath." He activated the holographic projector. Chris's image appeared, then the scene shifted, a car losing control, slamming toward him. "Ha ha! That's right! Serves him for slandering me," Jiaozi said, grinning. He laughed at the spectacle, fetched a dragon blood drink and some popcorn, and settled in to enjoy the show. Final Destination world. Chris hadn't yet had time to make sense of why he'd been transmigrated when a pickup truck swerved to avoid a truck and careened toward him. At city speeds, that crash should have torn him to pieces, but Chris's reflexes were in the single-digit milliseconds. The truck couldn't even have grazed a hair on him. Still, seeing the driver screaming in the cab made Chris hesitate for a split second. Then his body blurred, and he was suddenly in front of the out-of-control vehicle, bracing both hands against its hood. With a thunderous boom, Chris slammed the runaway pickup into the grass beside the road, lifting its rear half into the air. The dead fish it had been hauling were flung into the sky, arcing over the front of the truck and landing all over Chris. He was suddenly soaked and reeking of rot. Jiaozi's grin widened at the sight. Chris, however, had no idea he was being watched. He only knew this world felt hostile, as if it resented him. The trembling pickup driver clambered out and blurted, "Sorry, sir. Are you all right?" "What do you think?" Chris snapped, suppressing his irritation. Anyone doused in a pile of dead fish wouldn't be in a good mood. The driver was sensible and terrified. He fumbled into his wallet, offered a wad of cash, and stammered, "I'm really sorry. This is for your dry cleaning." Chris checked the bills. $5,000. He accepted them and said with a smirk, "Be more careful next time. Not everyone can withstand a pickup truck crash like I can." "I will. I promise I'll be careful," the driver said, practically worshipful. Given how most people would have been maimed or killed by that load of fish, he had every reason to be thankful and cowed. With cash in hand, Chris headed off to shower and change. He couldn't stand hunting for clues about this world while smelling like rotten fish. He didn't yet know Jiaozi had sent him to a final destination world. He assumed it was just his terrible luck. Back on the plane, Alex jolted awake the moment Chris arrived in this reality. He checked his watch. 9:07 a.m., 18 minutes until takeoff. He exhaled and drank a sip of water, trying to shake off the residue of whatever dream had left him shaken. Two female classmates came up to him. "Hey, Alex, can we switch seats?" Ignoring the frantic waving of a male classmate who tried to stop him, Alex rose and gave up his seat. He only understood why his friend had protested when he sat in one of the girls' original seats. "Dude, you just ruined my chance for a romantic encounter. You've really let me down," his friend complained. Alex grinned. "Come on, you really thought you'd pick her up on this flight? Besides, we're headed to Paris. It's the city of romance." He ignored the protests, rested his head against the window, and felt inexplicably refreshed, like someone had absorbed the bad luck he'd sensed. Near the back of the same plane, a young couple spoke in hushed tones. "Relax, Sam. We escaped death's grasp. We should be embracing our new life," Molly said. Sam, still rattled, replied, "Molly, what if that police officer was on death's list too? If I inherited his remaining lifespan, would that put me back on death's list?" Molly stiffened, remembering the police officer's sudden tidy death. It shouldn't be. He didn't go to the suspension bridge with us. How could he be on the list? You're overthinking it, Sam." But what if Death's game isn't limited to one setup? What if he included this flight and started a new game? Sam's speculation made Molly panic. She even considered getting off the plane. Sam saw the fear he'd provoked and laughed uneasily. "I'm kidding, don't worry." He hugged her. "Look outside, the clouds have cleared. Isn't this a new beginning?" The captain's voice then came over the intercom. "All passengers on Flight 180, please be seated. The flight to Paris, France is about to depart." It was 9:25 a.m., the original takeoff time in the movie, the moment the plane was supposed to explode. Those tragic events had been fated to happen, but Chris's arrival as an outside anomaly had altered how Death's attention was distributed. Because the newcomer drew Death's gaze, the survivors who had once slipped off Death's list were nudged back toward their original destinies. In short, the balance had shifted. The ticking threats they'd escaped were real again. Even Iris, who'd hidden deep in the mountains and had once tangled with Death for decades, sat staring at the wind chimes she'd made. "Hey, Death, don't try any tricks. I know you're trying to lure me out. I won't fall for it," she shouted, trying to steel herself. But Death wasn't wasting his time on minor players at the moment. His attention was fixed on the anomalous monster who didn't belong in this world. 46. Death's target. While the survivors on the original Shinigami list were enjoying a fragile peace, Chris was already fed up with the relentless chain of near-death mishaps that had dogged him since he arrived in this world. Less than an hour had passed, and he had already faced disasters that would have finished off an ordinary person. A runaway pickup, an electrical shock in the shower, a sudden hotel fire, and then a collapsing roof beam. There had even been dangers he hadn't noticed at all. Dead fish hurled from the pickup truck, tons of weight falling from 10 meters up. That could have crushed someone instantly. His own body probably could have taken high voltage, but when he felt the electrical leak and happened to notice a cold steel wire looped around his neck, the pattern finally snapped into place. He suspected he was in the final destination world. What confirmed it was how quickly the hotel erupted into flames and how precise the injuries felt. No time to think, no chance to act. The beam above him split and came down before he could decide whether to jump. By luck, it wasn't a shopping mall roof. The beam and debris were only a few hundred kilograms, maybe a ton or two with rebar and concrete. Chris swatted it away, and then the whole hotel collapsed, burying him. Crawling out of the wreckage, he was certain he had landed in the Shinigami world. What Chris couldn't figure out was why he'd made Shinigami's list in the first place. He couldn't see the pattern. But Jiaozi, Dumpling, who'd been watching from the sidelines, had no trouble. Through the wristwatch on Chris's arm, Jiaozi confirmed his suspicion. "Of course," he muttered, sipping from his dragon blood energy drink. The caffeine and whatever else was in it sharpened his mind. The logic of the Shinigami world clicked into place at once. Their own world, he realized, had a Shinigami too. The first time he'd discovered it, he'd even caught the thing out of sheer curiosity, until Pete, the fat guy, dragged him off to take a bath before he could study it further. If not for Pete, Jiaozi liked to think, he might already have mapped out the death domain and found a way into the underworld proper. He sighed at the missed opportunity and settled back to watch Chris's unlucky streak. Shinigami, however, seemed to decide that Chris was a tough nut to crack and pulled back for the time being. That pause gave Chris time to compose himself. He took the $500,000 in compensation from the hotel, checked into a high-end place, had a long hot bath, changed into comfortable clothes, and then sat quietly in the lobby. He couldn't fight what he didn't understand, but he could exploit it. Shinigami was clearly planning something big for him. He had no idea what it was or how to stop it. His plan was simple: use Shinigami to extract compensation, then use the money to hire experts to study it. It wasn't elegant, and he didn't know if it would work, but it was the only sensible option he could think of. He underestimated how fast Shinigami would move. After a nap in the lobby, he woke up to find nothing had happened. Trying to buy time and comfort, he wandered up to the manager and tossed a wad of 20s on the desk. "Extend my stay 2 months," he said, flicking $20,000 at him, "and get me something to eat." The hotel manager's eyes went wide. He had been mildly irritated that this distinguished guest had been lounging in the lobby instead of retiring to his suite, and his earlier impatience suddenly felt like a sin. He took the money, slapped his forehead theatrically, and said, "Right away, sir," secretly convinced he deserved any reprimand for doubting a guest like this. Chris watched the manager's fawning for a moment and shook his head. Dedicated employee. Too bad he was a moron. After eating, Chris stepped back onto the street to see what Shinigami's rules were for attacking him. He wanted proof, something concrete that would confirm this place wasn't just a coincidence. He headed to an internet cafe, paid for a terminal, stomped out a cigarette butt the attendant had left by the wires, and sat down to search. His first search was Flight 180. Nothing. He frowned. Maybe the Flight 180 disaster hadn't happened yet in this timeline. He checked the date on the computer, May 14th, 2000. That pointed him toward the other known events: bridge collapses, the Skyview Tower restaurant incident, and when he searched for those, the hits came up. The pattern was unmistakable. This was the Shinigami world. Even with that confirmation, Chris still didn't know how to counteract Shinigami. He had watched all 6 Final Destination movies, and the picture they painted wasn't encouraging. Very few people ever truly survived. Iris, old woman, sharpest precognition, and perhaps the most stubborn fighter, had managed to scrape by, driven half mad by what she knew. The black coroner from later films? Not a Shinigami agent at all, just another fortunate survivor. The only people who got through it intact did so by learning the system inside out and making brutal, desperate choices. So Chris decided to start with Iris. She had been directly involved in the Skyview Tower disaster, and if anyone had gathered usable information about Shinigami, it would be her. He dug up old news about the Skyview incident and found reports tracing Iris's decline, how after that night she developed serious mental problems and holed up to keep her family from going out. Following the trail forward, Chris located the most recent reports, and from them, her current address. 47. Disaster escalation. After finding Iris's address, Chris wasn't in a hurry to go there. Besides the fact that her house was far from his, he had already spent $2,000 on rent and wasn't about to throw that away. He wanted to earn it back first. Fortunately, Death might have sensed Chris's plan. After mulling things over for most of the day, Chris realized that that dog-like Death was about to attack again. The man seemed to follow some rules. Before each attack, he left a hint. The hints were usually so subtle ordinary people missed them, but this time it was obvious. The guy next door was watching JoJo, the old 1993 version, and the scene playing was the one where Dio lifts a tanker truck and hurls it at Jotaro. At the same moment, a gust of wind made an ornament on the curtain knock against the internet cafe speaker, and a song started playing that happened to include the word explosion. With hints that clear, how could Chris not understand what was coming? He left the internet cafe and headed back to the hotel. He had to get there before the explosion. Only then would his money be earned back. In less than a minute, he crossed 2 blocks and returned to the hotel. From a distance, he saw a tanker truck. With his eyesight, he could even make out the driver, calmly smoking, truly courting death. Having confirmed the danger, Chris calmly walked into the hotel and pulled the fire alarm. Once the guests had frantically evacuated, he sat down in the same spot where he'd waited out the last disaster. When the tense moment arrived, a runaway tanker crashed into the hotel, heading straight for Chris on the sofa. This time he didn't dodge or try to stop it. He let the tanker shove him into the wall. Chris himself came away fine. Aside from dirty clothes, his posture hadn't changed much. The driver wasn't so lucky. The cab was twisted and the seat crushed him in place. A burning cigarette had left a scar on his chest. It looked as if Death had used that odd gust to blow the cigarette butt loose, panicking the driver and making him fumble his controls, which caused the crash. Chris rose, pushed the tanker truck aside, and watched the leaking gasoline creep toward exposed wires outside the hotel. The man in the cab, seeing Chris, shouted for help like someone clinging to a lifeline. "Hey, help me. This thing's going to explode. Pull me out, quick." Chris was indifferent. That driver had brought it on himself. He was driving a hazardous vehicle and chose to be distracted by smoking. An incorrigible fellow like that would sooner or later kill someone even without Death's interference. Better him than more innocent people. Maybe his family would get an insurance payout. The driver, furious at being ignored, cursed, "Idiot! Bastard! What are you doing? Come pull me out or we'll both die." "Did you hear me, you Bang! Chris couldn't stand the profanity. He kicked the already deformed side of the cab. The force twisted the cab further and crushed the still shouting driver to death. "So annoying," Chris muttered. Looking down at the man gasping his last, Chris said, "You're definitely going to die, but who told you I'd die too?" No sooner had he finished mocking than the gasoline reached the exposed wires and ignited. A towering blaze swallowed the Grand Hotel. The shockwave blew Chris clear. His entire back was scorched by the heat, and the golden hair on the back of his head vanished. By the time firefighters put out the inferno, 2 days had passed, and Chris was still lying dead among the ruins of the upscale hotel. It seemed as if he really had been wiped out by the tanker explosion. Death didn't target him again during those 2 days, apparently convinced he was gone. Only Jiaozi, Dumpling, from the Family Guy world, who had been watching Chris the whole time, understood what had happened. Oh ho ho, smart move. He tried to fake his death to fool Death. But you forget, you're an outsider. Death doesn't have a list for you. Just as Dumpling said, night fell and the firefighters, having found nothing, dispersed. A heavy rain began suddenly. Lightning flashed and thunder rolled, and several bolts struck down directly at the man feigning death. "Damn you, Death, you're not playing fair," Chris spat. The lightning recarbonized his scorched flesh. This time his eyes and eyebrows blackened to charcoal. He dared not pretend any longer. If he was struck 8 or 10 more times, he'd actually be dead. Pushing ashes off himself, he surged up like a demon crawling out of hell and bolted at a speed invisible to ordinary people. But the thunder seemed to have locked onto him, following his path with continuous strikes. On the third hit, most of his body made it into a nearby bar, but his left calf, half a step too slow, was completely carbonized. He dragged the leg inside, shook it, and the calf crumbled into a pile of black ash and fell away. The patrons sheltering from the rain screamed at the sudden sight. "Ah, monster! There's a monster! Help! Call the police! There's a demon! Let me out! Get me out of here!" Chris roared back. "Shut up, all of you! I'm human!" His roar cut through the thunder and proved Death at least a little incompetent. More bolts struck the bar's doors and windows, but the lightning rod diverted them, and nothing inside was harmed. Safe for the moment, Chris barked, "Go find me something to eat, meat and sugar. Hurry!" Under his repeated orders, the bar regulars scrambled. Soon a cart of large, bloody cuts of beef was pushed in, and tens of pounds of white sugar were hauled over. Chris didn't mind the raw meat. He grabbed a chunk and began gnawing. He took a couple of mouthfuls of beef, then shoveled white sugar into his mouth and had to wash it down with a bottle of red wine. With that intake, new flesh rapidly sprouted across his body. His lost left calf regrew. He cursed inwardly that he didn't have a dragon blood potion. One bottle of that would have saved him from eating hundreds of pounds of raw meat. "Damn you, Death!" Chris hissed as he healed. Since he had transmigrated, he'd never suffered so much. Right then, he had only one thought: to kill that damn Death. 48. In the name of the Father. The bar went silent, every head turning from the bizarre tableau inside to the lightning outside, those streaks of light like electric snakes across the sky. For a heartbeat, no one could tell what had just happened, what great demon had arrived, why God had flashed a miracle and apparently struck something dead. Then the body on the floor began to regenerate. Flesh knitted back, charred scabs flaked away, and as the face beneath was revealed, everyone realized God's strike had failed. When Chris's face finished healing, the mood shifted again. The same people who had been shrinking from him a moment earlier stared, slack-jawed, mesmerized by how beautiful he was. Their fear curdled into a kind of worship. If God had spared him after striking him, if a creature that looked like that could survive, maybe there had been a reason. Maybe God still loved this fallen son. One bolder patron edged forward and reached a finger out to touch Chris's shoulder. Before his hand landed, Chris caught the man's finger and, genuinely puzzled, asked, "Buddy, what do you want?" The muscular man didn't care. His finger looked like it might snap. He wrenched it free and shouted, "Oh my God, he touched me! The Son of God touched me!" Everyone gasped. Then, as one, they dropped to their knees and began to pray. A few burst into tears. "Son of God, tell us your name. We will proclaim your might and spread your glory," someone cried. Chris stared back, utterly bewildered. When he realized what they believed, a slow, amused smile crossed his face. He decided to play along. "You may call me Hong Shuquan," he announced. He took the role further in a theatrical voice. Long ago, the Father God made a covenant with humankind, bringing peace and returning to each what was rightfully theirs. But now an evil has arisen, the God of death, who disturbs the balance of life and death and twists mortal fates. I could not stand by while this demon acted with such arrogance. I slipped away from the Father's notice and descended as a mortal to subdue him. Chris squeezed out a few theatrical tears. "Alas, my Father holds the covenant like iron. He won't allow us to break even a jot. So I was forced to abandon half my divine form and come down as a man to finish this work." The crowd nodded along, eager to stitch meaning to what they'd seen. Chris had translated his speech into plain English, but a few of the words were lofty, and the idea felt distant to these working Americans. Still, the gist hit home. An angel had come down to fight a demon and was punished by his father. That explained everything. How else could someone so beautiful have been struck by lightning? It had been a punishment, not proof of evil. One man, eyes shining, blurted out a litany of titles. "You're the second son of God, Jesus' younger brother, His Majesty the Heavenly King who once ruled half the East." Chris paused a beat, then said with mock solemnity, "Let bygones be bygones. I have returned only to subdue demons, nothing more." That was enough. The man insisted to the others that they had been in the presence of Heavenly King Hong. The faithful consensus formed quickly. Seeing how thoroughly he'd convinced them, Chris turned to two burly bikers near the bar. "Brothers, I descended in haste, and the Father's lightning ruined my clothes. Could you—" "No need for underwear," one of them interrupted. Before Chris could finish, both men were stripping, jackets, shirts, leather pants, belts, bare in a matter of breaths. If Chris had let them go on, they would have handed over everything. He took their clothes, pulled them on in the middle of the room, and stood up in a patched-together, leather-clad look that somehow made him look like a movie antihero. Several women in the bar gaped and flushed with excitement. Several men swallowed and looked awkwardly thrilled. It annoyed him that some of his male followers seemed so enthusiastic for the wrong reasons. Outside, the rain slackened. Chris watched the last of the storm fade and figured the god of death had retreated for now. He planned to find Iris and gather real intelligence, but first he realized he had a sudden congregation on his hands, and a useful one at that. He didn't know much about the god of death beyond what he'd seen in films, but he had noticed a pattern. The god of death seemed to mark people who had survived improbable circumstances and later take them all at once. If he could manufacture more survivors, or at least force the god of death to expend attention, he might increase the demon's workload. Chris didn't understand the demon's motives, but he felt sure the entity's methods, killing through cascading accidents, must tie into something vital to its existence. "Go," he cried, spreading his arms at the doorway. "My father's followers, go spread his glory. Warn the lost lambs tormented by this evil demon. Save the poor souls about to be taken." He raised his voice and, with his pulse quickening, let his words carry like a rushing river through the room. The effort warmed him. A faint steam rose from his hair, where rain hit the heat of his head. The spectacle looked miraculous to the crowd. They prostrated themselves and prayed in silence. Chris hadn't expected the heat and steam to have such an effect, so he deliberately tilted his face to the last drops and let the rainwater run over him. He rebranded the god of death's cold, accidental killings as demonic rituals, the devil stealing souls through secret rites, and urged them to take simple precautions. Install smoke detectors, check wiring, think before you act, he told them. Always confirm safety before you do anything. Keep an eye on one another. He preached this blend of sermon and pragmatic safety for nearly an hour. By the time he finished, the sun had broken through and the ceiling stopped dripping. The steam around his head dissipated. He closed on a grand note. "Children, I go now to slay the evil demon so he can no longer harm people. Remember my teachings." As Chris left, the bar rose and chanted in unison, "Farewell, Heavenly King. May the Heavenly King prevail in subduing the demon." 49. Brothers United, Chris, the bar's beloved holy son, was doing something outrageous in the parking garage. He had originally planned to find the hotel manager and demand compensation for his ruined emotions and room charges. But he hadn't gone far before he found a motorcycle key on the guy whose clothes he'd borrowed. No thinking required. It had to belong to the biker. Chris turned on his heel, walked to the lot, and started trying keys. There weren't many bikes. It didn't take long to find the tough guy's ride. He didn't bother asking. If the guy could lend his clothes, why not his motorcycle? He swung a leg over, grabbed a pair of sunglasses from a neighboring bike, thumbed the starter, and fiddled with the rearview mirror. "Too bad I was born too late," he said to his reflection with a grin. "If the T-800 didn't look like me, Skynet would have made a mistake." Satisfied, he kicked the engine and roared off toward the bank that shared the hotel's name. He hadn't forgotten his original plan to make money. The hotel wasn't some dive. It was a national chain with its own bank and insurance arm. A place like that didn't deserve any sympathy from Chris. When he arrived, the bank was chaotic. People were scattered, some in bathrobes, others wild-haired. The travelers Chris had pulled out by pulling the fire alarm. A few must not have escaped. Police were there, frantically checking identities and tallying the dead. The hotel's clientele weren't ordinary. They were well off, and their deaths were a legal and financial nightmare. "Ah, sir, you're here!" the hotel manager called the moment he saw Chris. He dropped the guest he'd been consoling and hurried over. Not long ago, a mysterious guest had paid $2,000, and then the hotel had been devastated by a tanker explosion. When the manager had inventoried guests afterward, he'd assumed that unlucky patron had died. Seeing Chris alive was a windfall. It could save the hotel tens of millions in payouts. No wonder he dashed over, abandoning his other duties. Chris walked past grieving families to the bank counters, then stopped and asked flatly, Do you know the whereabouts of my brother? Have you found his remains? At once the manager's smile froze. He'd already realized something wasn't right. You're his younger brother? He blurted. I came as soon as I heard. We haven't. Have you really not found him? The manager recovered his composure and snapped into protocol. We'll need to verify your identity. If you try to defraud the insurance, we'll have to involve the police. Chris didn't rise to the accusation. He pointed to his face. Look properly, he said hard. My brother's complexion was at least 2 shades darker than mine. You can't mistake that. The manager hesitated, then remembered the guest's photo and the distinct fairness of his skin. The memory clicked into place. He reddened. I apologize, sir. It was my mistake to doubt you. If you can provide valid proof, we'll expedite the compensation. Nearby, Jowsy Dumpling, watching through his wristband in the Family Guy world, chuckled with delight. Well done, Chris. Make those capitalists bleed. Chris's grin faded. The manager's acceptance was only half the battle. He needed proof, and he had none. When he'd checked in before, he'd given a name, paid, and left his bag. There'd been no ID check. In this world, he still had no registered identity. Where would he find documents now? The manager, misreading his silence for sorrow, offered condolences. Please accept my sympathy. According to company policy, you're eligible for at least $30 million in compensation, plus an additional $2 million for emotional damages since your brother paid $2,000 for his stay. $32 million. Chris's eyes brightened, then clouded. He could taste the money, if only he had papers. Jowsy felt the same tug. He couldn't spend the money himself, but he loved the idea of profiting off the greedy. He started his operation. From his end of the wristband, he reached across time and systems and hacked into the United States Social Security database. He fabricated a full identity for Chris and created a matching record for his supposed brother. Chris's wristband buzzed. A subtitle flickered across its tiny screen. You owe me this money. Stewie left a message. The manager mistook Chris's downward look for grief and patted his shoulder. The dead can't be brought back, sir. Take whatever inheritance you can and live on. Bolstered by the wristband confirmation, Chris straightened and replied with a practiced sadness. I will. I'll take his share. He was led to a bank counter and sat down as a teller typed. The clerk found the entries Jowsy had slipped into the system and glanced up. Mr. Stewie, can you confirm? She asked. Chris, still playing the part, blinked at the name on the screen. Stewie Griffin, under his own. He hesitated for only a second, then forced a dry laugh. Yes, that's me. For $32 million, Chris swallowed his misgivings about the wristband's meddling and went along with it. 50. Death was in a hurry. When Chris walked out of the bank, his fortune had once again skyrocketed. The $500,000 that had gone missing had reappeared, multiplied 64 times. He refused the bank security's offer of an escort, picked up a heavy bag in each hand, and strode out through the main doors. The hotel manager, seeing him off with a smile, turned back to the other guests who were still waiting for compensation. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, Marriott Hotel has the means to make you whole. Please quietly submit your information and then wait for our compensation. Seeing what had happened to Chris, the travelers waiting for money finally believed the manager and stopped causing a scene. After calming them, the manager beckoned a former hotel security guard over and spoke in a low voice. Did you find out who owns that tanker? Sir, we did. It's under Rockefeller. We still don't know the specifics. The legal department is still negotiating. The manager went back into the bank cubicle and told the bank manager handling the payouts, the tanker belonged to Rockefeller Oil. Raise the amounts. They can definitely afford it. The bank manager, who had been full of worry, visibly relaxed. So it's a Rockefeller company? Then the original $40 million was a little low. He pulled out 6 sheets of paper. Here's the list of confirmed dead. 1 is the tanker driver. If we pay $35 million each, that's $175 million. Add the living claimants, and we're just over $200 million. We'd be short. How about we count the tanker driver as a hotel fatality, claim $50 million per deceased, and $500,000 per living person? The hotel manager ran the numbers in his head. 6 dead at $50 million would be $300 million. 127 survivors at $500,000 each was $63.5 million, still under 400 million. He was nearly 60 with a large family, and the prospect of being held accountable for the hotel's destruction frightened him. "Can we push it further?" he asked, steeling himself. "I'm going to be blamed and will lose my job. This kind of windfall doesn't come around twice. Why not make enough to last the rest of our lives? Imagine us in the Maldives." At that, the bank manager's face shifted, and he finally clenched his teeth. "Do it. Falsify some past guest records, and I can report up to $1.3 billion. With that, the two men reached a crooked agreement and set about inflating the claims. Meanwhile, Chris took his money and set off to find someone. First, he went to a motorcycle shop and traded for a classic Harley Terminator model, bought a matching new set of Terminator gear, then headed toward Iris's town. The internet had only named the area where she lived, but Chris figured if he got close enough, he could ask around. After all, Iris had once been famous for saving hundreds of people. She wasn't that far removed from public memory, and with her eccentric reputation, someone would surely know her. After filling the bike with gas, Chris handed a few bills to the attendant, and, under the man's astonished stare, roared off. But as soon as he left, it seemed the Grim Reaper's cooldown was over and a new round of accidents began. Less than 2 hours into his ride, a log-laden truck lost control and its cargo burst free. It was a moment straight out of Final Destination 2. Chris scanned the road and saw he was the only rider. "You really love me, huh, Reaper?" he muttered. A log hurtled toward him from a few dozen meters away. It was moving fast, but Chris was faster. He twisted the throttle and cut onto the grassy shoulder. The Harley's top speed was 148 kilometers per hour, over 41 meters per second. Not as fast as Chris could run, but fast enough. He weaved through the flying logs like a thrill-seeker through cannon fire, and before long, rode up beside the wrecked truck. The driver stood in front of the cab, dazed and in pain. Chris leapt off the bike and barked, "Fuck you! You almost killed me!" Then he throttled away, leaving the stunned driver blinking in the dust. Because the Reaper's design had spared everyone else, Chris didn't intend to kill the driver, just to let him know what had almost happened. The reprieve lasted a few hours, then the air shifted. A tattered newspaper page fluttered past Chris's face, reporting the number of satellites America had lost. Then a crack opened in the sky, and Chris, with his keen eyesight, made out a strangely shaped lump of metal. Satellite debris. He followed that first piece and watched as thousands of metal fragments rained down, of all sizes. Worse, mixed in with the junk, were meteorites. He swore under his breath. "Fuck you, Reaper. Weren't there supposed to be only satellite fragments? Now meteors too? That's low." Seeing the debris field ahead, Chris turned the handlebars and tried to steer clear. Even with his rapid healing, he wouldn't survive being hammered by a hail of metal and rock unless he could get out of the zone. He pulled aside and breathed easier as the dust cloud rose behind him. But the relief didn't last. He looked up and saw it, a giant meteor, several hundred meters across, plummeting straight toward his location. It was descending with the kind of power that reshapes continents. Chris abandoned the bike and bolted on foot. The meteor's speed, even a conservative 11 kilometers per second, meant total annihilation. The size of that thing could gouge a crater kilometers wide and hundreds of meters deep, trigger seismic waves for hundreds of kilometers. Fear sharpened him. He pushed himself beyond every limit, the air dragging at him like glue. His clothes began to singe and peel away as he pierced the sound barrier. At extreme speed, nearly 300 to 340 meters per second, he covered over 2 kilometers in almost 7 seconds. Behind him came an ear-splitting roar as the impact arrived. In a single instant, a massive shockwave picked him up and hurled him several kilometers, flattening him like a piece of meat. But oddly, the violence didn't kill him. It pulled him out of the crater's deepest zone. Outside the several-kilometer-wide impact pit, Chris lay on the ground in the dust, a broken rag doll of a man, but alive. His body had been turned almost entirely to liquid by the forces involved. Only a portion of his brain had not liquefied. He confirmed 2 things at once. He had survived, and the Grim Reaper was getting desperate. Chapter 51. What is Death Afraid of? It was hard to tell whether Death himself was hurried, but Jiaozi, Dumpling, certainly was. When he saw the giant meteor plummet from the sky, he felt a cold premonition. He might have enjoyed seeing Chris in trouble, but he absolutely didn't want the interesting big guy to die, especially not because of something he'd done. Dust filled the air, and Chris vanished from sight. Panicked, frantically searched for anything that might help. Through his wristband, he saw Chris's vital signs were critical. He was minutes from death. Jiaozi's dumpling hands moved faster. He grabbed tools and began modifying the dormant pod that housed Chris's talent. With his friend on the edge of death, Jiaozi's dumpling tinkering escalated into near madness. The pod shifted shape several times like a gag from a cartoon. After the last transformation, Jiaozi dumpling tossed the dragon blood beverage he'd been drinking into the pod, now a temporal pod, activated the temporal teleportation device, and sent over 20 bottles to Chris via his wristband connection. The dying Chris felt something brush his hand. Like a drowning man seizing a life preserver, he forced his shattered fingers to close around the objects. With a pop, a plastic bottle ruptured. Orange-red liquid gushed out and soaked his skin. Chris's still-living cells hungrily absorbed the high-energy fluid. One bottle restored an entire regrown index finger. With that finger, he dragged his arm toward the remaining bottles and forced caps open. As he drained one bottle after another, his cells recovered. By the time over 20 bottles had been consumed, most of his body had been repaired and his life was temporarily saved. But it wasn't enough. The meteor's blast had been devastating. Even though Chris hadn't been at ground zero, the shockwave had shattered his body. Over 90% of his cells had been annihilated. If Jiaozi, dumpling, hadn't provided cross-temporal aid, Chris had been prepared to force his remaining active cells into cannibalizing his own body just to keep a sliver of himself alive. With Jiaozi's dumpling help, he didn't have to be that pathetic. "Hey, Stewie, are you listening? Send more dragon blood drinks," Chris croaked. He could sit up now. He still had 2 calves, 1 arm, and bits like his ears and nose that hadn't been fixed, so he shouted into his wristband. In the Family Guy world, Jiaozi, dumpling, had already pushed a small cart down the street to fetch more supplies. He heard Chris's call, sighed aloud, and muttered, "I really should have let that idiot die. Does he think I'm not thorough?" Still, he loaded 2 boxes onto the temporal pod and fired the transmission again. The 2 boxes vanished from his cart and reappeared before Chris. "Fuck, I really should have given this guy some spatial storage. Carrying these things is exhausting." Jiaozi dumpling groused, watching a projection of Chris grab a bottle and drink. He sat back, fuming, then realized he'd forgotten to save a bottle for himself. Chris drank 3 more bottles. His cells finally returned to their original state. He sat up, repaired, and exhaustedly promised, "Thanks, Stewie. I'll repay you when I get back." Jiaozi, dumpling, laughed with relief and pride, completely missing the gravity in Chris's tone. "Ha ha ha, he's still polite, worth the trouble caring for him." If Jiaozi, dumpling, was happy, Chris was not. He had already decided that whatever had driven death to strike at him like this had to be reckoned with. In Chris's mind, death had to be killed, and Jiaozi, dumpling, the one who'd exposed his history and meddled in it, needed dealing with too. After a few perfunctory thanks to Jiaozi, dumpling, Chris grabbed the remaining dragon blood drink and stepped out into the smoke, naked. The dust thrown into the atmosphere by the meteor had disoriented him. Visibility was near zero, the sky dimmed as if in a doomsday painting. Cellular remodeling and the drink's boost had also reawakened his physical potential. During his desperate flight earlier, he'd felt he'd broken the sound barrier. His speed must have reached at least 300 meters per second, close to the speed of sound. Even when he'd been fleeing, he'd realized his body's basics had already been pushed beyond their old limits. What used to be a top sprint of over 100 meters per second now only felt like a warm-up compared to his current capability. Even so, after walking, or more accurately, moving, at that impossible speed for tens of minutes, he still hadn't escaped the smoke. The dust plume had reached the stratosphere and blotted out the sun. There was no point trying to find Iris here. Besides, she likely had no information about death that would help him, and a catastrophe this big would throw the whole region into chaos. Iris, cautious by nature, wouldn't ignore danger. She would move and hide, making her even harder to find. And the more chaotic things were, the more opportunities there were for death to strike. Chris decided to head back to town and regroup, to think carefully about the blatant attack death had launched at him. He had the sinking feeling he'd done something bad enough to make death act so brazenly. He didn't know whether death's attack came at a cost, or if death could act like this without consequence. But one thing was clear: Chris had provoked death. His plan now was to find out what he'd done, then do it again. If he repeated whatever it was that drove Death wild, he might expose more of Death's weaknesses, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to kill him. 52. Test. Chris arrived in town and checked into a motel. He was completely naked except for an unfamiliar wristwatch made of some unknown material. He wasn't bothered. He'd been caught naked more than once since arriving in this damned world. As soon as he arrived, he found a laundromat and picked out a fresh set of clothes. Then, he found a few hooligans who had been taking advantage of the chaos and borrowed some pocket change. The town was at least 100 kilometers from the meteorite crater, but the massive dust cloud still hung over everything. The thieves, seeing an opportunity in the confusion, had been rifling through people's things. It was their bad luck, or Chris's luck, that he ran into them. They ended up sleeping it off in a garbage heap, and Chris walked away with a few $dozen in small bills. After checking in, he took a shower and began to go over what he'd done since arriving in this world: saving people, proselytizing, insurance fraud, or searching for other names on the death list. He immediately ruled out the last one, searching for other death list candidates. Although death had targeted him while he was on his way to find Iris, Chris dismissed the idea that finding her would change anything. If Iris truly knew death's weakness, with her crazed determination, she would have used it to save her descendants. Even if she didn't have the power, she could have contacted the state apparatus. Chris didn't believe Americans in this era couldn't dig 3 feet deep to find death's weakness. The year 2000 was America at its most ambitious. The old world hegemon had retreated to its small island. The former rival had disarmed. The phoenix from across the ocean was only just reborn and hadn't yet spread its wings, and former allies had already joined its ranks. America seemed invincible. There wasn't a single power it had to answer to. If anyone in control of that country learned there was such a thing as death, a special department like S.H.I.E.L.D. would spring up. Even if death were just an unknown life form with limited powers and sloppy work habits, it would be easy prey for the most powerful national apparatus of the time. Even if it were the embodiment of death itself, it might still be captured. The fact that Iris hadn't done anything like that suggested she had no concrete information, only hard-won survival experience. That was why Chris gave up on finding her. It probably wouldn't help. She had used her life to warn her descendants, and yet her family line had still died out. If finding Iris wasn't what made death target him, then the other possibilities were easier to isolate. Saving people might have disrupted Death's list and exploded its workload, making it angry enough to come after him. Proselytizing, altering its name, might have disturbed its hold on faith. Insurance fraud could have been an insult, provoking a spiteful response. In the Final Destination scenarios, people who mock death often meet exceptionally tragic ends. Death, it seemed, had petty emotions. Counting the options, Chris figured saving people and insurance fraud wouldn't make death afraid. At most, they'd make it anxious. Only his haphazard proselytizing had the potential to undermine a deity built on incense and faith, and so truly terrify any faith-dependent entity. After sorting through the possibilities, he decided to test them to see which action had made death so intent on killing him. This town's sparse population and poor financial services made insurance fraud impossible. Proselytizing required the right circumstances and audience. The bar incident had been a fluke, and Chris doubted he could manufacture something like it here. That left saving people the only option he could carry out immediately. He left the motel and took advantage of the chaos. The dust-filled air made the roads hazardous. Even cautious drivers could easily get into trouble. In this environment, accidents were almost guaranteed. Chris stood by the roadside and watched traffic. The sandstorm reduced visibility to a few dozen meters for most people. Even with goggles, they'd only see tens of meters. With that little time to react, a single slip could end badly. A motorcycle's roar cut through the wind, fast, at least 90 kilometers an hour. Chris, who'd ridden recently, knew the sound of bikes at different speeds. He measured the distance and readied himself to run. Before the rider even came into sight, there was a sudden, sickening crash. Chris sprinted toward the sound. He covered the distance in seconds and spotted the motorcyclist thrown clear of the wreck. The rider still had a helmet on. Chris slowed as he approached, careful not to create a gust of wind strong enough to cause secondary injury. He pried the scratched helmet off and saw the man bleeding from all 7 orifices, breathing shallowly, more out than in. Chris twisted open a bottle of the dragon blood beverage he carried and poured half of it into the rider's mouth. The man's breathing steadied immediately. Chris checked the premonition in his heart, the sensing that had marked his dealings with death. Sure enough, after the life was saved, a faint sense of malice ticked upward, but only slightly, barely 1% of the original surge. Saving a life only raised its malice toward him by this much? Chris stood there, turning the question over in his mind. What exactly governed death's hatred? 53. Return the favor. From the moment he arrived in this world, Chris had felt a focused, hostile intent directed at him. At first, he assumed it was because death had placed him on some list, but after experiencing death's intensely personal targeting, after Jiaozi had sent him here, and after the biker beneath him had been resurrected because of him, Chris began to piece together the real reason death was after him. Watching death's patterns in the films made the picture clear. Everyone he targeted were descendants of the people Iris had saved. In other words, death had been trying to correct past mistakes. Iris had rescued at least dozens of people decades ago. Their survival created lines of descendants who, in turn, interfered with the lives and fates of others. Those second and third order effects produced more people who should have died but didn't, fugitives from death's list. Over decades, just counting the ripple effects from Iris alone, Chris realized the problem was enormous. Conservatively, there were at least tens of thousands of such fugitives, and hundreds of thousands or even millions of lives had probably been altered indirectly. If being death is a job, then you're hired to procrastinate yourself to death, Chris muttered with a sinister smile. He stepped off, and the biker he had revived went back onto his predetermined path. If it hadn't been for the experiment, Chris would have ignored such a self-destructive fool. He had originally saved the man with no intention of doing more, planning to leave him to see whether death would spare him. But then Chris realized his act of saving someone as an outsider increased death's workload, presumably why death wanted him dead. If killing someone could also affect death's workload, would that lighten it or add to it? Operating on the utilitarian principle of not asking 2 masters to do one job, Chris decided to make the biker the subject of a different experiment. When the biker's head exploded, Chris immediately felt death's malice spike. He laughed out loud. "Ha ha, what's the matter? Did I ruin your pristine fake accounts, or force you to scrap a carefully laid plan?" The growing malice only made him happier. The last time it had reached this intensity, a tanker truck had crashed into him, but now he didn't sense any imminent catastrophe. That told him something important. Summoning catastrophes like meteorites cost death something. At least for a short while, death wouldn't be able to target Chris again. Satisfied, Chris swung his leg over the fallen motorcycle, found it still ran, and rode back to the hotel to grab his drink and leave. If killing people could also create trouble for death, then he had no obligation to save those destined to die. In Chris's eyes, death was a diligent worker bent on fixing mistakes, and Chris was the troublemaker who could multiply his workload by hundreds or thousands of times. If he caused enough big, chaotic problems, that diligent worker might simply wear himself out trying to fix them. He didn't know if the plan would work, but it cost him nothing to try. If death used butterfly effects to create accidental deaths, Chris would create a butterfly effect so massive and unmanageable it would exhaust him. In human society, the best way to do that was to disrupt the capitalists who shape millions of people's futures. With his target in mind, Chris headed for the nearest major city. He rode in a much lighter mood, humming as he went. The city wasn't the same one he'd been to before, but it was an equally opulent metropolis. As he entered, he spotted a familiar logo. Ah, Marriott Group. Their headquarters, he said. What a coincidence. He tossed aside a newspaper picked up in the small town. The headline detailed the Marriott Group's lawsuit against an oil tycoon for an enormous sum. Chris winced at the memory of the more than $30 million he just had obliterated by the meteorite before he could spend it, the money he still had to use to pay Jiaozi. If he'd listened to the hotel manager and opened an account, it would have been safe. But hindsight was useless now. Better to cause some trouble for death by taking down a few capitalists. On the top floor of the Marriott building, an internal executive meeting was in progress. 1,300 million. Those two idiots actually dared to ask for that much. They're just ordinary people. Where did they pull that number from? One executive barked. According to the investigation, the hotel manager tampered with the guest check-in records, changing all guests who checked in over the past 2 months to those 2 days, another replied. Humph. Clever, but we'll handle this internally. As for Rockefeller, we'll still demand the 1,300 million. Even if we spend $1 billion on the lawsuit, we must win it. At the boss's stern command, David Marriott, the company's head, inhaled on his cigar and nodded. Anthony, the CEO, said, Family scandals aren't for public airing. I'll arrange a discreet exit for both of them. David exhaled and hummed in agreement, but Anthony frowned and spread a document on the table. One problem, one of the deceased's relatives has already received the compensation in cash, and there's no way to recover it right now. Deceased, Chris Griffin. Beneficiary, Stewie Griffin, David read aloud, then raised an eyebrow. Are you sure this isn't an insurance scam? Those are character names from Family Guy. Fox even tried to pitch me on that show once. Anthony rubbed his forehead, remembering the odd names. If Stewie had deposited the money in a bank, they'd have had a shot at recovering it. But the two fools had taken the cash and left. Even with Marriott's influence, tracking them down would be difficult in a day and a half. They could be in another country by now. 54. Lies Don't Hurt People, Shinigami World, Marriott Group Headquarters. Chris rode the elevator to the top floor that was normally off-limits, as if he were simply coming home. He stepped out and prepared to take the stairwell when 2 security guards, slacking in a corner, looked up in surprise. They barely had time to stub out their cigarettes before both drew rifles and trained them on him. That made more sense to Chris. How could a Fortune 500 company trust its highest-level protection to nothing but little pistols like in the movies? In the real world, these men carried rifles, and Chris almost respected the caution, if only they weren't about to face someone who wasn't merely human. With a flick of his toes, he closed the distance and hit them. The impact was brutal and blindingly fast. The 2 men were driven like meat against the stairwell wall. Chris didn't practice exaggerated martial arts or have anyone's immortality but his own recovery. These men had neither. They were dead, smashed and broken. He moved on up the stairs. At first he'd been relaxed. He hadn't expected anyone to be guarding the restricted floor. But now that he knew there were sentries, his pace shifted into something beyond human vision. For every mercenary he encountered, Chris extended a single finger and gently pressed it to their carotid. From Chris's perspective, the motion was slow, deliberate. To the guards, it was a reaper's scythe. None reacted before they became entries on the Shinigami's register. When he reached the only large door on the floor, he paused because he could hear voices inside. He stopped himself from pushing it open at once to listen. They were talking about him, about that family man, and about insurance fraud. The chatter didn't surprise him. In a multiverse where realms exchanged information regularly, such gossip was inevitable. But the phrase insurance fraud hit a nerve, and in a flash of fury, he shoved the door open and stormed in. Everyone in the conference room went silent. The 2 directors closest to the door had already gone for security when Chris burst through. That plan evaporated the moment they met his glare. As a senior director clutched his chest and crumpled to the carpet, Chris said coldly, "See? He had a heart attack. Don't blame me." Panic rippled through the assembled executives. Anthony, the company's CEO, tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, who are you, and what do you want?" The room waited. Chris ignored the question. Anthony forced a smile and obsequiousness to mask his terror. This was one of our senior directors. He holds 1.3% of the company. If you wish, we can transfer his shares to you as an apology for any slander. Chris blinked at the offer, amused. You really dare to try that? Believe me, I'm not here for money or praise. I'm borrowing something, temporarily. It's to deal with someone who's even more of a dog than you lot. David Marriott, the company's patriarch, visibly relaxed. He'd imagined someone ruthless who wanted everything. If this intruder wanted only to borrow something, then even his billions were safe. Anthony, ever the cautious manager, leaned forward. What do you wish to borrow? Tell us who this person is. With the Marriott Group's power, we may be able to help. Anthony's professional calm, flattering in the face of the insult, earned a small smile from Chris. He answered, but on his own terms. I'll tell you, but in reverse order. They nodded, confused, willing to follow his lead. Chris continued, the person I hate is someone you can't afford to offend. You all call him the Shinigami. A ripple of exchanged looks ran through the room. Anthony's face changed as he understood exactly what Chris meant. Chris preferred a different name. I call him the Hellox horse. He made a mistake, or a string of them, and then he went berserk. He tried to make up for the mistake by filling other people's death lists, patching the gap with lives, Chris said. He watched Anthony absorb the implication. Suddenly, Anthony understood why Chris used that ugly nickname. This Shinigami did arithmetic with human lives, much like a corrupt manager tries to cover missing funds. Wow, you're quick, Chris said, impressed and a little mocking. It took me days to figure out his method. You figured it out in minutes. I might be tempted to keep you on payroll. Anthony stood up, chair scraping, and bolted for the conference room partition. Terror overtook diplomacy. Run! This man is insane. He's going to kill us. Chris clutched his head dramatically. You ruined my rhythm. Then he grabbed a pen from the table and hurled it. With the force he could generate, the plastic cylinder was a high-velocity projectile. The pen punched through Anthony's skull and his head exploded in a shower of blood. Anthony's body took 2 more instinctive steps and collapsed. No more pesky clever ones, Chris said to the room. What are you waiting for? Follow him. Save me the trouble of explaining. The rest of the scene happened faster than any human eye could track. Chris kicked the conference table. The great slab smashed into David and the vice president and barreled them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were first crushed and then hurled from the building's height. Before the rest could scream, Chris snapped the necks of several executives in a fluid motion that left no time for terror to take hold. From the first shot to the last broken neck was less than 100 milliseconds. No human reaction at normal peak speed could respond. When the dust settled, Chris felt it. A surge of malice from the Shinigami, massive and sharpened. He smiled. Their secret was about to blow. He wondered what would happen next. Would the great Shinigami come for them? Whatever came, Chris's mood only brightened. He would go and find the next one the heavens had favored. 55. The Grim Reaper in a frenzy. Days passed in a blur, and the whole of America slid further into chaos. To tire death out and keep that infernal beast occupied, Chris pushed himself harder than ever. In a matter of days, he'd crossed more than a dozen states, restructuring corporations, pruning boardrooms, and breathing more life into local economies than anyone thought possible. With every company he dismantled, he felt death's hatred grow. Then, after the news broke about the deaths of so many financial magnates and capital heavyweights, and a few days of public ferment, the malice in his bones simply vanished. Standing on top of the Empire State Building, Chris watched the city below, as if waiting for death to unveil its next big move. He finished a cigar, crushed the butt under his heel, and went inside. Whatever death planned, Chris was ready. This had become a life-or-death struggle, not something that could be smoothed over with an apology. In the conference room, he found a cluster of elderly executives frozen with confusion. With the same casual cruelty he'd shown for weeks, Chris snapped necks and drifted out of the room. As he passed the head table, he glanced down and read the nameplate of the man he'd just killed. Anthony. The name tugged at a memory, a sharp mind he'd wanted to keep around to help analyze death. Too bad the man hadn't been cautious enough. He rode the elevator down and thought about his next target. Word had spread that a monstrous killer stalked America. Anyone with sense had fled. Those who remained were old, stubborn executives or mid-level managers convinced Chris was a relic of old assassins, a scavenging thief looking for payback. They'd survived decades of heavy taxes and believed they had nothing to fear from a petty thief of the new era. That arrogance made them easy. Click-clack, click-clack. A sudden noise from the elevator ceiling made Chris look up. Then every steel cable snapped at once. The elevator lurched, and the sickening sensation of freefall slammed into him. He smirked. Not even a meteorite could kill me. You think this will? He muttered. When the cab neared the ground, Chris threw himself up through the ceiling and cleared the plunging elevator just before it hit with a bone-jarring thud and flattened like tin. He climbed out of the shaft, pried open the first-floor doors, and walked into the lobby amid shocked stares. On the street, a road roller suddenly went berserk and charged him. A cement truck pouring for repairs flipped, sending a geyser of wet concrete into the air heading straight for Chris. Come up with something new, he taunted as he dodged. These tricks are ancient. If I cared about my clothes, I wouldn't even bother. The road roller, a 20-ton machine used for paving, barreled toward him. Chris lifted it and flipped it over as if it were a toy. Before the meteorite incident that had altered him, his explosive strength had topped 100 tons. Under the pressure of survival, those reserves surged again, making the maneuver easy. He barely had time to gloat when something cracked the back of his head like a baseball bat. He reached back and felt something wet and hard. Crimson stained his palm, and in the center, a deformed bullet. A bullet? He said to himself. How had a mere human managed that? A thunderous crack split the air. Before the sound reached him, he staggered again, and another deformed bullet dropped from his hair. Realization hit. He was being sniped. He locked onto the source in time to hear a second shot and saw a figure on a distant rooftop, a man in a black knit cap, white with shock, lips shaping curses. Chris grinned, flashed his teeth, and mouthed, "I see you." Then he vanished. The mercenary on the roof abandoned his rifle and sprinted for a planned escape route, muttering, "Monster, what did these businessmen piss off to get sent this thing?" He hadn't expected his armor-piercing rounds to have so little effect. He'd only hoped to slow the target and buy himself a minute. But Chris reappeared before the man could disappear from sight, leaning against a wall behind him. The sniper's eyes went wide. He swung up a micro-submachine gun and opened fire, not because he believed it would kill Chris, but in desperation to suppress him long enough to flee. The gunfire never reached its mark. Chris plucked the bullets out of the air like someone catching hailstones and flung them back. Dozens of projectiles snapped through the sniper's chest and left him a ruin on the rooftop. Chris glanced down at the fallen mercenary and laughed. "I didn't expect you to bring manpower into this. Seems you've run out of options. If you can do this much, why not call in the National Guard? Too afraid. Ha!" He laughed until the sound faded. Death, it seemed, made no further moves. If what Chris had been saying was true, maybe the Reaper had exhausted itself. This last, desperate inclusion of a mercenary had been its final effort, and it had failed. 56. Even death can crash. Nice. They finally went after the medical industry. Those money-grubbing bastards. Good riddance. Chris, who had just added to Death's workload, was finishing a hot dog near a park stand when the vendor began shouting over a newspaper. Glancing up, Chris saw the faces he had stayed up late the night before to hunt. Apparently, after seeing their company's stock prices slump, those executives had rushed back and even printed a statement in the paper to try to prop up the shares. It was only a tiny corner of the paper, but Chris noticed it out of boredom. Since they were acting so predictably, he couldn't disappoint them. That very night, Chris slipped into their homes and hurried their deliveries to Death. What puzzled him was that ever since he'd killed that mercenary, Death had vanished. For 2 days, there had been no accidents at all. Investigations had shown a significant drop in accidental deaths across America. Chris wondered if he'd overloaded Death and literally exhausted it to death. But he'd killed only around 1,000 people in that period. Powerful people, sure, but surely not enough to crash Death. If Death could be felled so easily, it was an embarrassingly weak system. To be safe, Chris decided to pick a few more targets at random and see if Death was really overwhelmed. He finished the last bite of his hot dog and asked the vendor, still folded over his paper, "Hey, sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course, I'm in a great mood. If you hadn't paid, I'd even give you a free one." The vendor laughed, folding the paper away. Then, less guarded, "Why do you ask?" "Never mind. Which bosses do you hate the most? If you can, tell me which city they're in." The vendor frowned, thought a moment, then shrugged. "Oil companies. Those vampires who dump environmental damage on towns. My hometown was ruined by them. That's why I'm out here selling hot dogs. If your next target is them, I'll give away 100 hot dogs to celebrate." He paused, then added, "Some of them are in Houston, I think, but I don't know the details." That helps." Chris got what he needed, thanked the vendor, and left. The vendor watched his tall back and muttered, "Strange fellow." By the time Chris reached Houston, it was afternoon. He picked up a city guide at a newsstand, an easy way to find major taxpayers, and confirmed several oil giants were based there. He mapped out their organizational structures and headed to their offices. His previous operations had been clustered near New York, so even if executives suspected him, they wouldn't think to flee the country. They assumed he was somewhere close by and couldn't hop all the way to Texas. Company CEOs moving around carelessly can affect stock prices. He'd already taught the pharmaceutical bosses that lesson, so executives often stayed put rather than abandon a sinking stock. For those men, corporate bankruptcy was more terrifying than death itself. Chris arrived at the headquarters of one oil company and went through his usual routine. Check if the key executives were present. If they were, walk into the conference room and finish them quickly. If many were absent, coerce the highest-ranking person present into calling a meeting, then wait for the rest to return. He'd used the method successfully a dozen times. Even after his reputation spread, the trick of calling them back to a meeting never failed. Luckily, everyone was present. Chris burst into the conference room and, following his customary method, dispatched them one by one. The entire process took a bare 2 seconds. Only the mass of executives made it feel longer. When Chris glanced at the meeting slide on the projector as he left, he understood why so many company heads from different sectors had gathered, planned to annex New York capital. So these were big players from Houston. No wonder so many executives were present. Several companies had converged, not just oil firms. Chris plucked a cigarette from the pocket of a peacefully sleeping old man in the lobby, lit it, and inhaled slowly. Had his luck changed? Was this coincidence? Maybe death was trying to ingratiate itself, to make amends. As the cigarette burned down, a crimson current of energy flowed into him. The sensation was a life essence he recognized, death's. With his multiverse-level talent, Chris couldn't imagine how that force could have remained intact, yet here it was merging into him. He didn't feel a simple boost in power. Instead, a new, unprecedented capability unfurled in his mental domain. He couldn't yet name it, but its arrival explained the odd convergence. In his perception, a vague, ethereal system governed fate across the nation. The strand responsible for life and death was far dimmer than the others, almost gone. That was because Chris had caused that portion to crash and freeze. Under the judgment of his talent, he had plundered its released life essence. In principle, that essence should have been taken 2 days earlier, but the main body of the fate concept had been holding it back. Today the main body finally failed, releasing that life and death stream to be devoured. The mass gathering of people from other fate strands had even been orchestrated so Chris could indulge himself. Understanding this, Chris chuckled and said aloud, partly in irritation and partly to the fate force itself, "You lunatic, I'm not a serial killer. If not for your brain-dead subordinate, I wouldn't have killed so many people." He explained himself to the main body of fate, whether it was conscious or not. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. 57. A Miracle with You? Family Guy World, Jiaozi, Dumpling's secret base. Oh, let's see who's back. It's Chris. Jiaozi saw Chris vanish into the Shinigami world on his wristband and knew he had returned. He leapt to his feet and shouted with joy toward the space-time pod. He hadn't forgotten Chris's promise to repay him, and he couldn't wait to study the strange laws he'd finally managed to detect. He'd once detected something similar on a Shinigami in their world, but because of Peter, the chance had slipped away and he'd ended up with no data at all. Chris pushed open the pod and stepped out. Seeing Jiaozi's eager face, he asked solemnly, "My dear brother, tell me exactly what happened with my trip this time. Can you give me a straight answer?" At the mention of old debts, Jiaozi's hopeful expression hardened for a moment. He waved a dismissive hand and said, "You must be exhausted. I won't bother you." He tried to slip away, but his short legs couldn't outrun Chris. Without moving his feet, Chris reached out and scooped Jiaozi into his hand. Thinking the act worked, Jiaozi immediately put on pitiful, innocent eyes. Chris seemed moved. He set Jiaozi down and turned to leave. Then, in a deliberately ominous voice, called over his shoulder, "Stewie, be careful. After all, the Shinigami is here." With that, he left the base. Jiaozi watched him go, confused. What did Chris mean? Were the laws he'd gleaned connected to the Shinigami? While Jiaozi puzzled, he missed the fact that the base door had opened when Chris went out. A gust of wind blew in, crept along the floor, and lifted an empty potato chip bag. The bag spun up and slapped onto Jiaozi's head. "Ah! Ack! What is this?" Jiaozi screamed, clawing at the slick bag. It wouldn't come off and only stuck harder as he fumbled, until at the last second he tore it away, gasping as if he'd been smothered. Fuck, Chris, you bastard! That prank is way too much." Seeing the strange gust on his detectors and the odd ripple on his instruments, Jiaozi was sure Chris was responsible. He stormed out of the base shouting and headed for the stairs to confront him. But when he reached the steep stairwell, he froze at the drop and could only yell from the doorway. "Chris! Are you trying to kill me? Don't you know suffocation is one of the greatest dangers for an infant?" Chris, appearing on the landing below, replied dryly. "Then do you know that for humans, fires, explosions, lightning, car crashes, meteor strikes, those are all extremely fatal?" "You didn't come downstairs," Jiaozi cried, as Chris's voice came from behind him. He spun around, then bristled at Chris's list. "No, that's sophistry. You're not an ordinary human anymore. Those things aren't dangerous to you now." "What about a meteor impact?" Chris said. "If your conscience hadn't kicked in and offered help, I'd have been dead or nearly dead." Jiaozi went quiet. He hadn't realized the Shinigami's threshold for manufacturing accidents was so high. If he'd known, he would have waited for Chris to get stronger before sending him in, or sent him to a different world where he'd be more likely to suffer setbacks. Chris squatted to meet him eye to eye and said seriously, "Can't you explain it now? Out of consideration for your conscience, I let you experience a similar near-death thing. I won't test more dangerous stuff on you, wouldn't want you really to kick the bucket." "Okay, you win this time, but I won't give up my revenge," Jiaozi said defiantly. Chris laughed. "Immature. I'm too lazy to bother with you." He realized Jiaozi, despite his intelligence, treated everything like a game. Arguing facts was pointless. He needed someone to play with, someone who made things fun, and right now that someone was Chris. With that in mind, he turned and went back into his room, leaving Jiaozi's threats ignored. Jiaozi wasn't bothered. He knew Chris needed him to understand his newfound abilities. The boy was still dependent on him. He headed back to his room to sketch up some personal protective gear and plotted the next time he'd get his revenge. Soon after, a fit of laughter turned into a coughing fit as he choked on his own spit. He suspected Chris again, but this time it was merely an accident. He recovered, cautious but undeterred. Meanwhile, in his own room, Chris had finally worked out the specifics of the Shinigami-like ability he'd picked up. It didn't manifest the way a true Shinigami's powers did. Chris's power showed up as a force of misfortune, bad luck that killed by engineering accidents. Its upper limit was low. It could cause plane crashes, car wrecks, train derailments, or cruise ship sinkings at most, and it couldn't act without human intervention. It could not summon natural disasters the way the Shinigami had used against him. In short, it was a significantly weakened version, orders of magnitude below the real thing. Chris could accept that. When the Shinigami had used natural disasters on him, he had sensed a cost being paid. From the sense of destiny his new power let him perceive, he guessed the Shinigami must have tapped into the broader concept of destiny itself to pull off those exaggerated feats. Even then, The part of the destiny concept the Shinigami used seemed limited. It was centered on the North American continental region, not the whole planet, he sighed. After everything, it's not even planet level. 58. Family worries. After getting a handle on his new abilities, Chris realized it was almost dinner time and went downstairs. When he reached the living room, though, he saw Louise wasn't cooking. Something felt wrong. He checked the calendar and nearly dropped it. April 15th. Fuck, I should have realized sooner. He ran upstairs, burst into Stewie's room, and demanded, Stewie, what did you do? Why are the times in both worlds synchronized? Stewie, who Chris still teasingly called Dumpling, was sitting on the bed clutching Rupert. He looked up, surprised by the shout, then calmly said, I made a time synchronization device. If you wear the watch, no matter how long you stay in a different world, time in the main world syncs with you. Besides, Stewie added with a smirk, it would be such a waste if I couldn't enjoy watching you get all flustered. Chris let out an exasperated laugh. You really are something. This wasn't the moment to argue. He'd been in the Shinigami world for 7 or 8 days, and if time was synchronized, that meant Louise and the rest had been worrying about him for as long. No wonder the house had felt so quiet. Louise and the others must have gone out searching. After all this time, without any sign of him, Louise was probably frantic. You know where Louise and the others went to look for me, right? Stewie blinked. He hadn't expected Chris to actually care that much about the family, more than the original Chris had, even. He shrugged. I don't know. Maybe the police station, waiting for news. Maybe they checked the nearby towns. Honestly, I've been watching you freak out all week. I didn't exactly keep tabs on them. Chris sprinted next door to Joe Swanson's house. Joe wasn't home, but Bonnie was, pregnant and beautiful, clearing the table. Mrs. Swanson, is Joe at the station? Bonnie looked up, saw Chris, and gasped. Chris, where have you been? Do you know how worried Louise has been? She stepped outside and asked gently where he'd been. Chris stumbled through explanations that didn't work. Seeing his distress, Bonnie stopped pressing and went to make a call. Never mind, I'll call Joe and tell them you're back. Louise is at the police station. Tell her not to run around yet. As Bonnie called, Chris tried to figure out a believable excuse for the others. He could hear Louise's sharp voice through Bonnie's phone. Yes, he's fine. Doesn't look hurt. Bonnie, watch him. Don't let him run off. I think this is a side effect of his head injury. He might be confused. Don't worry, Bonnie said. He's on my doorstep and looks normal. Okay, we're coming back. Bonnie hung up and waved. Louise will be back soon. Come in and sit for a bit. Want some tea? No, Mrs. Swanson. Stewie's still here and I'm worried about him, so I'll go home and wait. Bonnie hesitated, then nodded. All right then, come back if you need anything. Chris thanked her and went back. Bonnie stood watching the Griffin's front door, clearly still nervous. Louise's warning about Chris having another episode was fresh in her mind. As soon as Chris walked in, Stewie grinned. So, Joe wasn't home. You and Bonnie alone? Didn't you take advantage? What am I, a pervert? Bonnie's Joe's wife. I didn't even go in the house, Chris protested. Stewie only laughed harder. You don't have to actually go inside. The fact that you care about whether you went in proves you had thoughts. Your morals just kept you from doing anything. Chris stared at him. If he hadn't been sure he'd had no reaction at all, Stewie's insistence might have convinced him otherwise. He'd just come back from another world. Temptation hadn't occurred to him. He chuckled. Whatever makes you happy. I'm not arguing with you. Stewie's face changed. And don't you dare use that bad luck power on me again, or I will get really, really mad. Chris raised an eyebrow. The last time had apparently left an impression on the kid. He honestly had no intention of using that power on his family, except maybe Peter. As for dealing with Stewie after putting the whole family through a week of worry, Chris had something else in mind. Fine, I promise I won't use the bad luck power on you, but you better eat everything they make you tonight, or you won't be able to later. Stewie wasn't worried. With his anti-bad luck device nearly finished, he felt invincible. Just then, the front door opened and Louise swept in, collapsing onto the sofa and burying her face in Chris's shoulder. Chris, you scared me so much. It's okay, Mom. I'm sorry. I left in a hurry and only left a note before I went. Chris lied, wrapping his arms around the tired woman and aiming the blame squarely at Stewie. A note? What note? Louise wiped her eyes and looked at him, puzzled. I gave it to Stewie. Didn't he give it to you? Chris looked at Stewie. Stewie looked utterly bewildered. He gave it to me? No. Chris's face went pale. He slapped his forehead. Oh no. Did Stewie accidentally eat the note? That could be dangerous for his digestion. Louise, who had started to calm down, snapped back into worry. What? I've been frantic looking for you. If Stewie had an accident, what do we do? At that moment, Peter bounded forward, grin plastered on his face as if he'd been waiting for this chance. I know. Stomach pumping. If he swallowed something, we need to pump his stomach. Chris gave Peter an approving look. Peter beamed and scooped up a protesting Stewie. Come on, kid. We're going right now. Louise, you rest. Chris waved at the squirming toddler. Stewie, go along with Peter. This is for your health. Stewie hissed. Fuck you, Chris, you bastard. I'm gonna kill you. Brian, overhearing, felt there was more going on than Chris was letting on. He glanced at Chris and saw the cold look pinned on him. Deciding not to pry, Brian yawned theatrically. I'm beat. I'm going up to rest. Meg didn't catch the whole exchange and shrugged, heading upstairs too. Chris stayed, comforting Louise for a few quiet moments, then went up to his own room. 59. Elected Student Council President. The next morning at the Griffin household's dining table, Chris was drinking milk and eating bread when he saw Jiaozi come down the stairs looking miserable and head straight for him. Help me up to the table, he said. I don't have the strength to climb. Chris laughed and scooped him into Jiaozi's high chair. My pleasure, little brother. Humph! Snorted twice at the display of schadenfreude and said nothing more, though he hadn't forgotten the grievance. Heaven only knew how awful his stomach had felt last night. That beast Peter had even insisted on giving him an endoscopy to curry favor. The memory of it made Jiaozi Dumpling shiver. Chris, we already called the school to excuse you, Louise said. But Megan said you were apparently elected student council president. You should go back to school today to see what needs doing. It'll also look good for you when you apply to university. Chris, enjoying Jiaozi Dumpling's sour face across the table, froze at Louise's words. He hadn't expected the results to be released so fast, or to win while he wasn't even there. Megan, watching Chris's expression, couldn't help but gush with envy. What kind of charm do you have to get everyone to vote for you? I wish I were that popular. Shut up, Megan. Be proud of your brother instead of making snide comments. Louise snapped. Startled, Megan hunched her shoulders and muttered, Got it, Mom. Chris looked on, momentarily speechless. Some things were inevitable in every universe. Megan would always be disliked. Maybe that was the price of becoming an old god. He brightened and said, Okay, Mom, I'll go to school. I just hope my classmates don't get too enthusiastic. I'm not used to it. After breakfast, Louise drove them to school. Just before they got out of the car, Louise remembered, Oh, Peter said there's a surprise tonight. You two come home early after school. I'll pick you up. Chris nodded, puzzled. What surprise could Peter possibly have? Did he win the lottery? At school, when Chris walked into class, everyone stood and cheered. Chris, you're back. Did you know? You broke the school record, elected student council president with 99% of the vote. Chris raised an eyebrow, annoyed. Who were the slackers who didn't vote for him? 1% short of a clean sweep felt like a deliberate slight. Thankfully, Johnny, quick to read the room, sidled over and whispered, Boss, that missing 1% was just because a few kids were absent when the votes were cast. You couldn't get their votes. Chris relaxed and smiled. Johnny, don't be silly. I'm just worried my classmates trust me too much, and I won't be able to live up to it. Johnny blinked in surprise at the political instinct. Chris caught the look and turned coldly on his subordinate for thinking poorly of him. No, nothing, boss. I'm just moved to have a leader who cares about everyone. Johnny quickly wiped his eyes and added, tearful and earnest. Chris gave him a thumbs up and a pat on the shoulder. You're sensible. I'm starting to like you, Johnny. All right, class representative, please have everyone sit. Class is starting. Hearing that request from the newly elected president, the class rep hustled the students into their seats. Chris attended every class that day, but didn't pay attention to the lessons. Instead, he spent the time learning the rights and responsibilities of a high school student council president. Johnny did his best to explain with the limited knowledge he had. Fortunately, Chris only needed the broad strokes, and by the end of a few periods, he had a clear idea of the office's reach, and it exceeded his expectations. If he could mobilize enough students, Chris realized he could even challenge the principal and win. If he had the backing of the student body, no teacher could ignore him. With almost unanimous votes, he would be the kind of president who could go to City Hall and start building his political resume. 3 years of this, and come of age, he could be a city councilor without breaking a sweat. The thought excited him. "Johnny, are those scoundrels healed yet? Can they work?" Johnny was puzzled by the question, but answered honestly. "Thanks to a new functional drink on the market, their injuries have healed. What do you want them to do?" Chris's half-smile turned ambitious. "I need them to reform, quit smoking weed, get their tattoos removed, stop sleeping around. I want them to become positive role models quickly, to prove how qualified I am as student council president." Johnny was speechless for a beat, then cautiously reminded him, "Boss, you were only provisionally elected. You don't officially take office until next semester. For now, you're just an ordinary student." "Huh?" Chris stared at him in shock, making Johnny flinch. Damn, he'd forgotten. The excitement drained out of him. "Fine, then let them stay as they are. I'm too lazy to manage them this semester." Chris, who had spent the day at school, arrived at the roadside at the arranged time. Louise was already waiting, and Megan had climbed into the car and instinctively taken the back seat. "How was your day? Were your classmates enthusiastic?" Louise asked, concerned. Chris smiled. "Very enthusiastic. I like the atmosphere." "That's good. You've really changed. It seems knocking your head actually made you more confident." Chris went quiet at Louise's dark joke. The three rode home in silence. Louise went to cook, Megan put on music, and a bored Chris went to find Jiaozi, Dumpling. Brian was still manning the factory gate and hadn't finished work yet, so Jiaozi was the only one at home to play with. "Well, if it isn't Chris, so quick to make up with me, huh?" Jiaozi taunted from his room, not forgetting how Chris had tricked him earlier. "Don't be so petty," Chris said. "I thought after this morning we were squared." Jiaozi paused, remembering Chris lifting him onto the seat that morning. He mentally weighed whether to blame memory loss from sleep, but that would hurt his genius image. He snorted instead and let Chris into his room. "Fine. Say it. What do you want?" "Nothing complicated. Megan's boring, just TV and music, and Brian's at work, so I came to see you," Chris said plainly. "So I'm just your backup plan?" "Harsh," Jiaozi sniffed. "Whatever. Actually, I want you to add an active shutdown to the time-space synchronizer on my wristband. I don't want to travel for too long and lose track of time in the real world." "Why didn't you say that sooner?" Jiaozi grumbled. He took Chris's hand, fiddled with the band a few times, and the unit popped off easily. "Any other features? Throw them all at once, and I'll add them." Holding the wristband, Jiaozi asked for confirmation, but Chris just stared. "You're so clever, and you're asking me. I'd like a time stop too, but how realistic is that?" "Sking," Jiaozi rolled his eyes. "Big dreams. I can't do large-scale temporal stasis. The power unit on that band can't support freezing time. Forget it. Since you have no other specific demands, I'll design something myself. Don't complain if it bugs out." Chris shrugged. Since his bad luck ability could push misfortune onto others and nudge his own luck, he could protect himself from anything short of an absurd catastrophe. He left the rest to Jiaozi, and they started talking about the beverage factory. Stewie's skill had been genuinely powerful. West's shares were clearly valuable. The factory's output had hit 1 million bottles a day, enough to cover Rhode Island's population. But the drink's effects were so potent, people hoarded it, meaning it wasn't circulating. Jiaozi predicted once everyone realized the drink wouldn't be rare, maybe in 2 weeks, it would settle into the market. By then, they'd have significant capital and could move to the next phase, opening gyms and launching a fitness version of the drink to attract health-conscious customers. Chris frowned. The dragon blood beverage made people energetic and nourishing. In a sense, regular drinkers would be immune to many illnesses. Wouldn't that attract trouble from Rhode Island's pharmaceutical giants? Jiaozi burst out laughing. Chris, don't you know Rhode Island's biggest pharmaceutical concern is Carter Industries? Carter has a pharmaceutical company? Chris blinked. He'd known his grandfather was rich, but he'd never realized the full scope. Jiaozi smiled and pulled up a projected list. These are the assets under the Pooch-Schmidt family name, the assets you'll inherit. Chris knew in some timelines he'd inherit Carter's fortune, and in those stories he'd always frittered it away. But now making money was easy for him, so it barely mattered. Still, the projection shocked him. Steel, energy, finance, media, tech, pharmaceuticals, real estate. Carter's companies were involved in practically every essential industry in Rhode Island. The money he spent in the state would simply cycle back to him. No wonder his predecessor had burned through billions so fast. Look at his full name. That should tell you something, Jiaozi teased. Chris read it aloud. Carter Roosevelt Pute Schmidt? He stared. Is our family related to that person? No relation, Jiaozi said, waving a hand. It's just a common-sounding name. Then why show it? Chris asked, confused. Jiaozi grinned. The point is, Carter's tax payments are less than the grants he receives, and those grants eventually flow back to him. He sits near the top of the country's elite. Rhode Island is his small fiefdom. Nobody wants to touch him. So he can dominate every industry here because he's one of the top power players, and Rhode Island is small enough to be ignored, Chris mused. Exactly, Jiaozi said. And why wouldn't he let a thing like the dragon blood beverage land in his pharmaceutical sector? The current heir is Louise, and you're Louise's eldest son. Who else is there to hand it to? Chris thought about it and nodded slowly. It still felt strange to imagine such a ruthless capitalist showing any familial warmth, but he accepted it. After a while, Chris took Jiaozi downstairs for dinner. Peter sat at the head of the table, triumphant. My bereavement leave for my parrot has been officially approved. Gonzo's life was not in vain. Let's raise a glass. Peter drained his beer. Chris suspected he'd made up the parrot story to get the vacation. No one else reacted, which was confirmation. Oh, too bad I have human rights. Otherwise, I'd contribute to your grief, Peter. Brian joked, still holding a grudge about Peter trying to trade his life for time off. Come on, Brian. Don't be a killjoy. Peter waved him down, then announced, to celebrate, let's all go on a trip together. I've booked a place in Pawtucket, New York. Great, we can finally get out. Megan squealed and was immediately shushed by Peter and Louise. Shut up, Megan, they said in unison, and Louise added softly, Quiet while we're eating. Your father hasn't finished. Peter looked at her, puzzled. Huh? Oh, right. We leave at 6 tomorrow morning. Get some sleep tonight. As Peter finished, Chris felt a tiny fluctuation in his bad luck sense. Just a ripple, nothing major. A family vacation probably wouldn't be life-threatening, but his gut told him this trip wouldn't be as carefree as Peter hoped.